There are places where the body arrives intact and the mind begins, almost immediately, to change. Not through dramatic rupture, through slow, measurable erosion. The deep ocean floor, a sealed submarine running silent beneath Arctic ice. A cave system 3 kilometers underground where the air is completely still. These are not places defined only by physical danger. They do something specific to human cognition, something researchers have documented, mapped, and in some cases been unable to reverse. The human nervous system was not designed for total enclosure. What happens when a person cannot leave is the subject of 100 facts, each one drawn from documented research and clinical observation. What follows is not speculation. It is what confinement actually does. Fact 1. The pressure of no exit. The psychological response to confinement begins before physical entrapment occurs. The moment a person perceives their exit as uncertain, not necessarily blocked, but unclear, cortisol levels begin rising within minutes. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activates, flooding the body with stress hormones designed for short-term danger. Heart rate elevates, breathing shallows, peripheral vision narrows as the brain diverts resources toward threat detection. Studies on trapped miners have recorded cortisol concentrations more than 3 times the normal resting level within the first hour of confirmed entrapment. The body prepares to fight or flee. When neither option exists, it simply continues preparing indefinitely for an escape that may never come. Fact 2. What submarines do to sleep. Aboard a submarine at operational depth, natural light is entirely absent. The circadian rhythm, governed primarily by light exposure, loses its environmental anchor within 48 hours. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, which regulates sleep-wake cycles, depends on retinal light signals. Without them, it begins to drift. Within 3 to 5 days, individual sleep cycles desynchronize from the ship's artificial schedule. Some crew members sleep in fragmented patterns regardless of assigned rest periods. Melatonin secretion becomes irregular. Cortisol peaks at the wrong times. Reaction time decreases. In submarines, this is managed through rigid lighting schedules. When those controls fail, human chronobiology drifts toward a state with no natural anchor at all. Fact 3. The cave without a clock. In 1962, geologist Mitchell Siffer descended alone into a glacial cave with no clocks and no calendar, staying 63 days. When he emerged, he believed only 25 days had passed. His subjective time had compressed nearly by half. Without environmental time cues, called Zeitgebers, the brain imposes its own rhythm, and that rhythm runs longer than 24 hours. The average free-running circadian period is closer to 25 hours. In a 1972 repeat experiment, Siffer reported episodes of profound psychological distress, including a period where he contemplated suicide before the calendar reasserted itself. Weeks inside a cave do not feel like weeks. They feel like something with no reliable shape. Fact 4. The confined body's first response. Within 30 minutes of confirmed physical confinement, the body undergoes measurable physiological changes that require no conscious fear. Adrenaline enters the bloodstream. Glucose is mobilized from liver stores. Pupils dilate. Respiratory rate increases from a resting 12-16 breaths per minute to 20-25. The digestive system slows significantly. Sweat production increases, accelerating heat loss in cold environments. The body assumes, at a neurological level below awareness, that immediate physical exertion will follow. In confinement where no exertion is possible, these preparations serve no function. The chemistry of emergency exists inside a body that has nowhere to apply it. Fact 5. Darkness as a sensory event. Complete darkness, found in sealed caves, submerged submarines, or blacked-out bunkers, is not experienced as the absence of visual information. The visual cortex, deprived of external input, does not go quiet. Within minutes of total darkness, neural activity in the occipital lobe begins generating its own low-level visual signals. The brain, seeking pattern where none exists, produces vague shapes, peripheral movement, and shifting gradients of gray. This is not hallucination in the clinical sense. It is the visual system attempting to resolve a stream of pure noise. Functional MRI studies confirm genuine activation of visual processing regions in complete darkness. The brain is trying to see, and it is using nothing at all as its source material. Fact 6. What the Arctic does to the mind. Polar research stations impose confinement through temperature rather than walls. In Antarctic winter, conditions outside make exposure lethal within minutes, functionally confining personnel to structures spanning only a few hundred square meters. The syndrome that develops, called winterover syndrome, involves cognitive dulling, emotional blunting, and behavioral withdrawal. Memory consolidation weakens, decision-making slows, interpersonal conflict increases. Measurable reductions in thyroid hormone activity affect metabolism, temperature regulation, and mood. Studies document the pattern across dozens of stations spanning decades. The Arctic does not hold people with bars. It holds them with cold and dark, and a horizon that offers nothing new. Fact 7. The elevator and the containment response. Most people ride in elevators without distress, but when an elevator stalls and the control panel offers no useful feedback, a predictable neurological sequence begins within 2 to 4 minutes for a significant portion of the population. The proximate trigger is loss of control perception. The amygdala responds not merely to physical danger, but to the removal of agency. Rescue data from elevator entrapments shows psychological distress peaks not in the first minutes, but between 5 and 30 minutes, after initial calm but before any confirmed rescue signal. The walls of an elevator have not changed. Only the knowledge of departure has been removed. That knowledge, it turns out, was doing most of the work. Fact 8. Carbon dioxide before oxygen falls. In sealed spaces, CO2 accumulation typically becomes dangerous before oxygen falls to a critical level. Normal atmospheric CO2 is 0.04%. At 1%, mild cognitive slowing and headache are detectable. At 3%, reachable in a sealed space within hours, headache becomes pronounced and anxiety rises sharply. At 5%, nausea and confusion develop. The brain interprets elevated CO2 not as chemical poisoning but as suffocation. The suffocation response is one of the most primitive and overpowering neurological states a human brain can enter. In confined spaces where CO2 is slowly rising, the psychological deterioration often precedes any genuine oxygen crisis by a substantial margin. Fact 9. The underground body. Mine workers and cavers spending extended time more than 100 meters underground experience biological baseline shifts distinct from simple stress. Blood pressure runs slightly higher than surface equivalents. Vitamin D levels drop measurably within weeks, affecting calcium metabolism, immune function, and serotonin-linked mood regulation. Workers on extended underground rotations report increased fatigue at equivalent workloads. Appetite disruption is common. Circadian misalignment compounds these effects. The body does not simply endure underground existence, it reorganizes itself around the conditions it finds. In doing so, it moves progressively away from the biological calibration for which it was built. The readjustment upon return to surface takes time that is measured in weeks, not days. Fact 10. Sensory deprivation's early phase. Research into sensory deprivation consistently identifies a predictable early phase lasting 20 to 45 minutes. During this period, most subjects report paradoxical relaxation. Muscle tension decreases, breathing slows, heart rate drops modestly. The absence of external stimulation initially reads to the nervous system as rest. Cortisol levels may actually fall. Subjects describe warmth, heaviness, and mental quieting. This early response is why flotation therapy has been investigated for genuine therapeutic applications in anxiety and chronic pain, with measurable positive outcomes in sessions under 90 minutes. But the early phase is simply the first chapter. before the nervous system recognizes that the absence of stimulation is not going to be temporary. Fact 11. What happens to the voice underground? Deep cave systems distort sound in ways that take time to recognize as distortion. Hard rock walls and enclosed air columns create reverberation patterns that blur words and make the direction of sound harder to localize. After several hours underground, subjects begin unconsciously modifying vocal patterns, speaking more slowly and more deliberately, as if compensating for degraded clarity. Over longer periods, some describe their own voice as sounding unfamiliar, as if originating outside themselves. The brain relies on the sound of its own voice as one anchor for self-localization. In caves, that anchor begins to drag. The voice a person has carried their entire life begins slowly to feel like something that belongs to the space around them. Fact 12. The bunker's psychological architecture. Cold War-era bunkers were designed to sustain human life for weeks or months. Engineers understood structural requirements well. The psychological requirements of occupants received considerably less attention. Habitation exercises found behavioral changes beginning as early as day 3, not extreme, but measurable. Conversation patterns shifted. Social hierarchies became more rigid. More significantly, the absence of natural context, of weather, ambient outdoor sound, unstructured visual space, created what one study called a contextual void. Humans are deeply context-dependent. Remove the background and the foreground, the self becomes harder to define. The bunker that was built to preserve life also, quietly, began eroding what made that life feel coherent. Fact 13. The forest at night has no exit. Dense forest at night functions neurologically as a confinement event, though its boundaries are organic. The visual field is reduced to a few meters. Sound carries unpredictably, amplified and dampened by tree trunks. The horizon, the brain's primary geometric reference for orientation, is entirely unavailable. Studies of individuals lost in forest environments document a characteristic pattern: initial directed movement, followed by increasing circling behavior as spatial reference dissolves, followed by paralytic stillness. The forest did not close around the person. The navigational apparatus simply failed. The result, neurologically and behaviorally, is indistinguishable from physical confinement. The trees are not walls, but they function as walls. Fact 14. Submarine depth and the pressure on behavior. At 300 meters, a submarine hull sustains approximately 31 atmospheres of external pressure, roughly 456 pounds per square inch against every surface. The crew is physiologically unaffected because the interior is maintained at surface equivalent pressure. But there is a documented psychological effect of knowing the environment outside exists. Submariners with higher anxiety sensitivity scores show elevated baseline cortisol at depth compared to equivalent surface operations, even when workload is identical. This is not a rational response. The pressure cannot harm them. It is a perceptual one. The mind computes the conditions outside and responds to the information regardless of whether the body is protected from it. Fact 15. What silence does to the auditory system. True silence, measured in an anechoic chamber or found in the deepest sealed cave, is not the simple absence of sound. Within minutes of entering genuine silence, most people report hearing their own heartbeat, then breathing, then blood movement near the ears. Anechoic chamber recordings consistently capture subjects describing these physiological sounds as unexpectedly loud and disorienting. In the Orfield Laboratories chamber in Minneapolis, which has measured ambient noise as low as -9.4 decibels, most visitors become uncomfortable within 30 minutes. The auditory system, receiving no environmental input, amplifies its internal gain. The body's own machinery becomes the acoustic landscape, and in that silence, it is very loud. Fact 16. The relationship between temperature and fear. Cold independently elevates cortisol, activates the sympathetic nervous system and increases norepinephrine, the same biochemical channels activated by psychological threat. In cold confinement, the two stimuli compound each other, depleting the body's regulatory reserves more rapidly than either would alone. Survival training research shows that individuals in cold, confined environments reach decision-making impairment at significantly shorter durations than those facing either condition alone. The brain simultaneously manages thermoregulation, threat assessment, and spatial reasoning, and does not have unlimited resources for all three. When thermal load increases, the cognitive budget is reduced. Cold and confinement together are considerably more dangerous than either condition experienced separately. Fact 17. Trapped in the body's own gravity. Muscle fiber recruitment drops within 24 to 48 hours of confinement-enforced immobility. Protein catabolism accelerates as the body breaks down muscle tissue for metabolic maintenance. Bone density loss begins within 72 hours of non-weight-bearing immobility, a fact documented extensively in spinal cord injury and bed rest research. Deep vein thrombosis risk increases meaningfully within 24 hours of complete immobility. In collapsed building scenarios where a survivor is pinned but not critically injured, the physiological clock of immobility begins ticking alongside the psychological one. A survivor who has been physiologically stable for 12 hours may begin to deteriorate physically due to immobility alone, independent of injury, dehydration, or psychological state. Fact 18. The cognitive cost of monitoring exits. When a person perceives their environment as potentially inescapable, a measurable portion of cognitive bandwidth becomes dedicated to exit monitoring, continuous, partially unconscious scanning for departure routes. This process consumes working memory resources. In one study using a simulated confined environment, subjects who believed their exit was secured performed 23% better on a problem-solving task than subjects told the exit was unreliable, even though no actual physical difference existed between the two groups. The belief alone allocated cognitive resources away from the task. The mind watching the door is not fully available for anything else. And in environments that actually require sustained problem-solving, that reduction in availability has consequences. Fact 19. What cavers call the threshold. Among experienced cavers, there is a recognized experiential marker called the threshold, the point at which a person transitions from existing in a cave to being psychologically absorbed by it. It occurs somewhere between 2 and 5 hours underground. Surface concerns, time, appointments, relationships cease to feel immediately relevant. The cave becomes the entirety of the perceptual world. For experienced cavers who reach this threshold by choice, it is manageable. For individuals trapped underground without preparation, the involuntary arrival at this threshold is experienced differently, as the beginning of a total enclosure that extends beyond the physical into something that cannot be measured by the depth of the passage alone. Fact 20. The sound of structural settlement. In collapsed buildings, structural settlement, concrete shifting, metal bending, dust falling through cracks, produces sounds that are not necessarily indicators of further collapse. Settlement after an initial collapse is normal and may continue for hours without producing additional failure. But to a person trapped within the debris field, each sound represents potential renewed danger. The amygdala processes auditory threat signals in roughly 12 milliseconds, faster than conscious perception. Each settlement sound triggers rapid physiological alarm, cortisol spike, adrenaline release, cardiovascular surge, followed by partial resolution. Over hours, hundreds of such cycles accumulate. Survivors describe the cumulative effect as more exhausting than any physical exertion they had previously experienced. Fact 21. The drift of temporal perception. Time perception is not a passive recording. It is an active construction assembled from sensory input, attention allocation, memory formation, and emotional state. In confinement, where sensory input is reduced, memory formation slows because there is less to encode. Reviewing the period later, the mind finds fewer events to count and estimates the duration as shorter than it was. But in the present moment of confinement, time feels extended, each minute long, because attention has nothing to occupy it. This paradox, time simultaneously dragging and compressing, undermines the ability to reason about the future. Planning, resource packing, and psychological equilibrium all depend on temporal orientation. When that orientation fails, the cognitive structure around it begins to loosen. Fact 22. Industrial confined spaces and the rescue trap. OSHA classifies permit-required confined spaces as those containing or potentially containing serious hazards. Among the leading causes of confined space fatality is atmospheric hazard, oxygen deficiency, or toxic gas accumulation. What makes these statistics psychologically significant is the pattern of multiple fatalities per incident. The initial worker enters and becomes incapacitated. A colleague, seeing the collapse, enters to assist and is also incapacitated. In one analysis of confined space fatalities, more than 60% of deaths in multi-victim incidents were rescuers, not initial victims. The prosocial impulse to help overrides rational threat evaluation. The confined space harvests this impulse reliably across different cultures, training levels, and professional contexts. Fact 23. Peripheral shutdown in extreme cold. When temperature falls to the threshold for cold injuries, the body implements a hierarchy of sacrifice. Blood flow to fingers, toes, ears, and nose is reduced through vasoconstriction to preserve core temperature. The physiological logic is sound. The behavioral consequence is loss of fine motor control. At finger temperatures below 15 degrees Celsius, fine motor tasks become difficult. Below 8 degrees, they become extremely impaired. In confinement scenarios inside cold structures or near freezing caves, the ability to signal for help, operate equipment, or perform first aid decreases as the confinement continues. The hands that might solve the problem become increasingly useless precisely as the need to solve it increases. Cold and confinement create an elegant physiological trap. Fact 24. Behavioral sink in closed populations. Studies of human populations in genuinely confined, closed-loop environments, Antarctic stations, submarines, long-duration spaceflight simulations, document predictable behavioral patterns over time. Social withdrawal increases. Interpersonal aggression intensifies in its subtler forms. Irritability, passive conflict, territorial behavior around personal space. Group cohesion, which tends to strengthen initially in adversity, weakens over longer confinement durations. In HIC simulations for Mars mission research, crew conflict was identified as one of the primary threats to mission success in simulations lasting 6 months or more, not technical failure, but the behavioral consequences of people who cannot leave each other. The walls do not need to press inward for the social world inside them to contract. Fact 25. The neurochemistry of waiting. The brain's dopaminergic circuitry, which regulates motivation and reward anticipation, is sensitive to uncertainty. Intermittent, unpredictable reward schedules produce higher dopamine activation than fixed, predictable ones. In confinement, the uncertain arrival of rescue creates an intermittent anticipation cycle. Each sound may signal rescue. When it does not, dopamine drops. When the possibility arises again, it rises. This cycle, repeated over hours or days, is neurochemically exhausting. It produces emotional volatility in which hope and its withdrawal alternate rapidly, depleting motivational reserves. Survivors consistently describe moments of false hope, the sound that turned out to be settlement, as more psychologically damaging than the baseline experience of confinement itself. Fact 26. What the Hadal Zone feels like. The Hadal Zone, ocean depths greater than 6,000 meters, reaches pressures of approximately 1,100 atmospheres at the Challenger Deep. Human occupancy requires vessels maintaining surface-equivalent interior pressure. The psychological experience inside a deep-sea submersible has been documented by the small number of researchers who have made the journey. The darkness outside the viewport is described consistently as qualitatively different from other kinds of darkness, not simply the absence of light, but an active presence. The vessel's interior is small. Outside, the pressure that would obliterate the human body is present in every cubic meter of water. The awareness of that boundary between the survivable interior and the unsurvivable exterior does not resolve during the dive. Fact 27. The mathematics of remaining air. In any sealed environment, the air supply is finite and calculable. Divers and confined space personnel are trained to think in terms of remaining gas, but the presence of a countdown has psychological effects beyond the informational. When estimated remaining time falls below what appears sufficient to resolve the situation, cognitive performance deteriorates sharply. The countdown, which was serving a planning function, crosses into something else entirely. Survivors of air-limited scenarios, cave divers who lost tanks, astronauts who experienced suit malfunctions, describe the transition from calculated to panicked as extremely rapid. It occurs reliably when estimated remaining air drops below approximately 30%. The resource that was sustaining calm becomes, in its diminishment, the primary source of panic. Fact 28. Underground water and the sound of rising. Many cave systems flood seasonally or in response to surface rainfall. Experienced cavers monitor water levels continuously. Untrained individuals trapped in flooding caves describe the psychological experience of watching water rise in a confined space as among the most profoundly disorienting possible. The space above the water narrows. The time available to identify a solution decreases at a rate set by hydrology, not by anything the person can influence. The body's drowning prevention instincts, among the most powerful in the neurological hierarchy, activate before the water arrives. Physiologically, the anticipation of drowning resembles drowning. In flooding caves, this begins when the water's surface is still meters away. Fact 29. Thermal neutral zone and its disappearance. The body maintains core temperature through thermoregulatory mechanisms requiring metabolic energy. In most confinement environments, caves, collapsed structures, abandoned tunnels, ambient temperatures fall well below the thermoneutral zone, requiring continuous metabolic investment in heat production. In hot confinement environments in industrial vessels, sun-exposed collapsed debris, ambient temperatures may exceed core temperature, requiring active evaporative cooling. In both cases, the body spends metabolic currency on thermoregulation at every moment, reducing the energy available for cognition, physical activity, and immune function. In prolonged confinement, the thermal environment is not merely uncomfortable. It is slowly depleting the physiological reserves that everything else, including the ability to reason about how to survive, depends upon. Fact 30. The perceptual narrowing of threat response. Under acute stress, the visual field literally contracts. Attention concentrates on the perceived threat source. Peripheral information is filtered out. In most threat scenarios, this is adaptive, but in confinement, where danger is diffuse and environmental, perceptual narrowing works against the person. Potential solutions: a crack in the wall, a change in air quality, the faint sound of movement outside, may exist in the periphery being actively filtered away. Rescue professionals train survivors to deliberately broaden their attention as a skill. The difficulty is that the stress response producing the narrowing is not subject to direct voluntary control. The brain under threat sees less. In confinement, seeing less may mean surviving less. Fact 31. Isolation's effect on immune function. Extended isolation has measurable immunological consequences. Research on Antarctic winterover personnel has documented reactivation of latent herpes viruses, including Epstein-Barr and cytomegalovirus, during extended isolation periods. These viruses remain dormant in the nervous system after initial infection and are normally suppressed by immune surveillance. Under combined pressure of social isolation, disrupted circadian rhythm, and chronic moderate stress, immune competence declines enough to allow detectable viral reactivation in blood and saliva. NASA has observed similar patterns in astronauts on long-duration ISS missions. In genuinely confined environments where medical care is limited and air is recirculated, a compromised immune system represents a secondary threat that grows quietly alongside the primary one. Fact 32. Decision fatigue in closed environments. In confinement environments, continuous demands of environmental assessment do not allow the cognitive rest that decision fatigue requires. Someone confined must continuously assess. Is this sound dangerous? Should I move? Should I conserve energy? Each micro-decision consumes working memory. Studies of rescue personnel managing prolonged entrapments show that survivor decision quality degrades predictably with duration, independent of sleep, food, and water status. Initial decisions are generally accurate. Decisions after 8 to 12 hours show increasing impulsivity. Decisions after 16 or more hours show preference for simple, familiar options over complex but more effective ones. The decisions that matter most in confinement tend to arrive late, when that degradation is most pronounced. Fact 33. The weight of the ceiling. Claustrophobia is not simply a fear of small spaces. Research identifies the core fear as anticipated consequences, specifically suffocation, entrapment, and loss of control. The spatial trigger most reliably associated with claustrophobic onset is not width but ceiling height. Ceilings below approximately 2.1 meters produce disproportionate anxiety responses even in individuals without clinical claustrophobia. The mechanism involves postural and proprioceptive systems. A ceiling that eliminates the vertical range of motion, preventing standing upright, triggers a response in motor systems experienced as constraint, which propagates into emotional circuitry. Mind tunnels requiring crawling, cave passages demanding prone movement, collapsed spaces forcing sustained crouching. These impose the full load of this response. The ceiling does not need to be falling to feel as though it is. Fact 34. Dehydration and cognitive threshold. Fluid loss of just 2% of body weight, approximately 1.4 liters for a 70-kilogram person, produces measurable cognitive impairment. Reaction time slows. Short-term memory recall declines. Mood deteriorates with increased anxiety and irritability. At 5% fluid loss, confusion, severely slowed reasoning, and motor coordination impairment develop. In confinement scenarios where water is unavailable, a common circumstance in collapse, cave, or tunneling accidents, dehydration begins within hours. Confinement stress simultaneously elevates the body's fluid demands through increased sweating and metabolic rate. The person who needs to think most clearly is simultaneously being deprived of the fluid substrate that cognitive function requires. Dehydration in confinement is not just a physical danger, it is a cognitive one. Fact 35. Proprioceptive drift in microgravity. The ISS's habitable volume is approximately 388 cubic meters, shared by 6 individuals with no exterior access and no ability to leave. Within days of microgravity exposure, the vestibular system begins receiving conflicting signals. The otolith organs, which detect gravity, report an absence of the downward force they have processed continuously since birth. Space adaptation syndrome, nausea, spatial disorientation, headache, affects 50 to 75% of astronauts in the first days of a mission. Over longer durations, the brain remaps its spatial reference frame. Up and down become functional constructs rather than felt realities. This remapping subtly affects not just physical navigation, but the processing of spatial metaphors embedded in thought. The mind that no longer knows which way is down has lost one of its most basic orientational anchors. Fact 36. The tunnel and the end that doesn't come. Tunnels present a spatial challenge distinct from caves or closed rooms. Their linearity creates persistent anticipation of termination. A person moving through a tunnel assumes, at a basic level, that it ends. When the end does not appear, when the tunnel continues beyond the range of available light, or circles back, or floods, the violation of that expectation produces a documented response in disoriented underground workers. The brain's spatial mapping system, which estimates position and distance, is calibrated for the tunnel to resolve into an exit. When it does not, the estimated position becomes unreliable. The passage begins to feel not like a corridor, but like an enclosure, though its physical dimensions have not changed. That transformation requires only the removal of certainty about where the passage goes. Fact 37. Auditory vigilance and its costs. In confinement following collapse or flooding, auditory vigilance increases dramatically. The person listens continuously and exhaustingly for sounds signaling rescue, danger, or change. The auditory cortex, operating in a sustained high-gain state, evaluates every creak, drip, and air movement. This process consumes attentional resources continuously. Studies of combat personnel in high-vigilance states document cognitive performance decrements comparable to moderate sleep deprivation after 24 to 48 hours. In confinement, this vigilance does not switch off. It continues as long as the environment remains uncertain, which, in most confinement scenarios, is the entire duration of entrapment. The cumulative cost accumulates silently alongside everything else, draining the very system needed to recognize rescue when it finally arrives. Fact 38. Metabolic conservation and the stillness protocol. Survival trainers teach a behavioral framework for confinement scenarios: reduce movement to minimum, control breathing rate, lower metabolic rate through voluntary calm, and conserve glucose and water. The physiological rationale is sound. At rest, the average human burns approximately 80 calories per hour. The panic response may increase this by 50%. In a confinement scenario with zero caloric input, each unnecessary expenditure shortens functional survival time. But implementing this protocol is psychologically extreme. The confinement stress response specifically increases movement and energy expenditure. Fighting it, achieving metabolic stillness under extreme stress, requires physiological self-regulation that most people have not trained. The mind trying to save the body by keeping it still is working directly against every instinct the body has developed for this situation. Fact 39. Phosphine hallucinations and visual hunger. Extended total darkness produces visual phenomena that are neurological rather than psychological in origin. Phosphines, visual perceptions arising from mechanical stimulation or spontaneous neural firing in the visual cortex, present as flashes, dots, rings, or geometric patterns. After extended periods of total darkness, some individuals report more complex experiences, shapes that persist, brief coherent images. These may represent the visual cortex generating content from memory and imaginative reconstruction, attempting to resolve an informational void. Researchers studying cave isolation have documented these phenomena at durations as short as 4 to 6 hours of complete darkness. The brain that cannot see begins, eventually, to manufacture vision. The images it produces are not reliable, but they are the visual system's response to a darkness that has refused to provide anything to look at. Fact 40. When group dynamics reverse. In the early hours of a group confinement event, social cohesion tends to strengthen. Shared threat activates pro-social behavior. People share resources and maintain each other's morale. But this cooperative phase has a duration. Research on Chilean miners trapped for 69 days in 2010, the best documented extended group confinement event in modern history, shows that after initial cohesion, group dynamics began stratifying. Leadership disputes emerged. Resource allocation became contested. Social grievances from before the confinement resurfaced in amplified form. The shared enemy, the confinement itself, was insufficient to maintain permanent cooperation when the confinement lasted longer than social bonds could sustain without the renewal mechanisms that normally maintain them. The group that entered the confinement was not the same group that navigated its final weeks. Fact 41. What the spacecraft window shows. The window of a spacecraft is among the most psychologically significant features of the vehicle's interior. It is the only point of contact between the confined interior and the external universe. Astronauts on long-duration missions consistently report that time spent at the window has a measurable restorative effect on psychological state. NASA behavioral health research documents window time as among the most frequently requested and reported mood-positive activities for ISS crew members. The window provides depth, change, and scale visual information that the confined interior cannot match. When windows malfunction or are blocked, crew members report disproportionate distress relative to the physical inconvenience. The window is not decoration. It is a neurological anchor. Its absence is felt immediately. Fact 42. Acoustic confinement in urban collapse. When reinforced concrete collapses around an occupant, the resulting debris field changes the soundscape in ways that directly affect survival and rescue. Concrete and rubble absorb sound efficiently, potentially attenuating the survivor's voice to near inaudibility within 1 or 2 meters. Percussion signals are more efficiently transmitted through solid materials than through air, a fact that rescue professionals now train survivors to use. Beyond the technical problem of sound transmission, the acoustic environment inside a collapsed space is profoundly disorienting. The familiar urban soundscape is replaced by the sounds of the debris itself: settling, cracking, dripping water, distant machinery vibration. The brain attempts to assign meaning to each sound. Working with inadequate data, the errors in that interpretation can be consequential. Fact 43. Sleep architecture under threat. The sleeping brain maintains partial vigilance through a threat monitoring system involving the thalamus, amygdala, and frontal cortex, which continues processing environmental input even during sleep. In secure environments, this system operates at low sensitivity, allowing deep sleep to proceed. In perceived threat environments, sensitivity increases markedly. Deep slow-wave sleep, during which physical restoration occurs, is fragmented or absent. REM sleep, supporting emotional processing and memory consolidation, is similarly disrupted. The result is sleep that is physiologically present but restorative only to a fraction of normal capacity. After 48 to 72 hours on this reduced quality sleep, cognitive performance approaches the equivalent of no sleep at all. The mind that needs to be most functional, in the environment that demands the most, receives the least restorative support. Fact 44. The smell of confinement. In sealed or poorly ventilated spaces, the air chemistry changes as CO2 accumulates, oxygen decreases, and organic metabolic byproducts from occupants build in concentration. The olfactory system connects directly to the limbic system with minimal cortical mediation. The smell of confinement, distinctive and recognizable across rescue scenarios, triggers associations below conscious identification. Research on olfactory processing in stress contexts suggests smell-mediated stress responses are particularly resistant to cognitive override. Telling oneself, "The smell is not dangerous," does not eliminate the limbic response to it. Experienced disaster workers describe the smell of a trapped space as something that stays with them. The body knows what the air smells like when things are wrong, and it responds to that information regardless of what the mind concludes. Fact 45. Cognitive mapping failure. The hippocampus maintains a cognitive map, a spatial representation that the brain uses for navigation, orientation, and the embedding of memories in spatial context. In unfamiliar confined environments with limited visual landmarks and restricted movement, this map fails to develop adequately. Studies of people navigating featureless tunnels, identical mine corridors, and similar cave passages document that without reliable cognitive maps, spatial memory becomes unreliable. The person becomes lost not because the environment is impossible to navigate, but because the brain's mapping system was given insufficient material to build an accurate representation. In confinement, where navigational errors might mean moving toward danger rather than toward exit, the failure of the cognitive map is not merely disorienting. It is potentially terminal. Fact 46. The psychological experience of depth. Interviews with mine disaster survivors and cave rescue subjects reveal that depth itself carries psychological weight beyond its practical implications. Being deep, knowing that hundreds or thousands of meters of rock or earth exist between oneself and the surface, appears to engage gravitational cognition in a specific way. The weight above feels present as a concept even when it cannot be felt physically. Survivors describe the earth above as having presence. This is not delusional thinking. It is environmental anthropomorphization that the brain employs when the environment's characteristics are persistently relevant to survival. The depth is not just a number. For the brain managing a survival scenario, it is a persistent, enduring companion that does not diminish when attention is turned away from it. Fact 47. Temperature inversion and disorientation. In certain cave systems and industrial confined spaces, temperature inversions exist, layers of warmer and cooler air distributed in counterintuitive vertical patterns. Warm air typically rises, but in sealed systems with unusual geometry, this can reverse. The body's thermoception provides constant low-level information about orientation and environment. When this information conflicts with other sensory systems, or when the familiar vertical temperature gradient is absent or inverted, the result is experienced as a form of dizziness or spatial uncertainty that cannot be resolved by any single sense. The person physically does not know which way they are oriented. This disorientation is not metaphorical. It is a genuine failure of the sensory systems that maintain the most basic orientation of body in space. Fact 48. What information deprivation does to certainty. When reliable information is absent, the brain does not simply suspend judgment. It fills the gap. In confinement, where estimates are generated from minimal data and the stakes are existential, the brain tends toward two dysfunctional poles. Some individuals generate excessively optimistic estimates that collapse catastrophically when reality contradicts them. Others generate excessively pessimistic estimates that produce premature behavioral surrender. The middle path, accurate uncertainty tolerance, is cognitively difficult and requires deliberate effort. For most people without specific training, that path narrows with every hour of continued confinement. The absence of information is not simply uncomfortable. It is an active threat to the quality of judgment at the precise moment when judgment is most consequential. Fact 49. Proprioceptive withdrawal. In prolonged immobility, the proprioceptive system, which provides the brain with continuous information about body position and movement, receives substantially reduced input. The joints are not moving. Pressure distribution on the skin is constant rather than variable. Research on sensory deprivation and immobility consistently shows that sustained proprioceptive reduction weakens the boundary between self and environment. The clear sense of where the body ends and the environment begins, one of the most fundamental aspects of embodied self-awareness, becomes less distinct. Flotation tank studies have documented temporary body boundary dissolution in sessions as short as 90 minutes. In conditions where environmental monitoring and self-regulation are essential to survival, even subtle blurring of the self-environment boundary represents a functional degradation in the systems most needed. Fact 50. The point of behavioral inversion. Survival psychologists have identified a threshold phenomenon called behavioral inversion, the point at which behaviors that were initially adaptive become actively counterproductive. A person conserving energy effectively may shift into complete passivity, abandoning signaling activities their remaining strength could still support. A person maintaining careful environmental monitoring may abruptly become cognitively withdrawn. This inversion does not reflect conscious decision-making. It reflects the collapse of the prefrontal regulatory systems that have been managing the confinement response, systems vulnerable to glucose depletion, sleep deprivation, emotional exhaustion, and sustained cortisol exposure. When they fail, what remains is lower-level automatic functioning. The person is still alive, but the layer of cognition managing the survival response has, in some important sense, gone offline. Fact 51. The first auditory hallucination. The onset of auditory hallucinations in confinement begins not with voices, but with simple, brief auditory events the person initially dismisses as real. A distant tapping, a word just below the threshold of certainty, a name. These early events may begin as early as 24 to 36 hours into profound isolation. They arise because the auditory cortex, deprived of adequate external input, generates its own signals. The brain's speech processing areas, specifically Wernicke's area, are calibrated to detect language patterns in acoustic noise. In a quiet environment, low-level spontaneous neural firing is occasionally interpreted as language. Most people, upon experiencing these early events, correctly identify them as internal. The distinction between internal and external sound, once identified, remains manageable until it is no longer stable. Fact 52. Dysynchronosis in the bunker. Long-term bunker habitation produces a syndrome of physiological and psychological disruption called dysynchronosis, the decoupling of biological rhythms from external temporal cues. Artificial lighting can theoretically manage this through disciplined scheduling. In practice, the social and operational demands of bunker habitation produce irregular lighting. Within 2 to 3 weeks, the crew's collective circadian profiles diverge substantially from each other and from any standard cycle. Individuals at biological peak alertness at 300 share a confined space with those in deep circadian trough. Beyond coordination problems, sustained dysynchronosis has systemic physiological consequences: immune suppression, metabolic dysregulation, hormonal disruption, and mood deterioration compounding with every passing week. The bunker built to sustain life is slowly, rhythmically, undermining it. Fact 53. When surfaces stop making sense. In low-visibility confinement, the hands become primary sensory tools. Texture, temperature, hardness, moisture, vibration, all become navigational and diagnostic signals. Experienced cavers describe hands-on rock navigation as a form of reading, but sustained tactile reliance in high-stress conditions produces a documented phenomenon. When a sense is over-relied upon, its error rate increases. The brain, reducing skepticism about touch signals because touch is providing most of the relevant data, begins treating ambiguous tactile signals as more definitive than they are. Surfaces that are slightly warm are interpreted as potentially reactive. Structural vibrations are interpreted as movement of living things. The fingers, operating as high-precision instruments in a low-information environment, begin reporting things that a high-information environment would have filtered away entirely. Fact 54. Paranoid ideation in isolated groups. Group paranoia, shared false beliefs about threat originating from within the group, is a documented phenomenon in long-duration confinement, typically emerging after 3 to 4 weeks. When resources become scarce, when things go wrong, and when communication with the outside world is absent, the group's threat assessment systems turn inward. In documented accounts from the Chilean miners' rescue, individual miners suspected others of hoarding food, communicating secretly with rescue teams, or receiving preferential treatment. In Antarctic winterover studies, unfounded suspicions about colleagues' motivations and exaggerated significance attributed to minor social behaviors emerged consistently. These are not signs of individual pathology. They are predictable outputs of the threat detection system operating in chronic uncertainty. The system working exactly as designed in a context where the design produces dysfunction. Fact 55. The stasis of unchanged space. Human perception is calibrated for change. The sensory systems are tuned to detect difference in light, in sound, in movement, in temperature. Sustained exposure to an environment that does not change, a cave passage identical in every visible direction, a bunker where no object has shifted in weeks, produces perceptual fatigue. Researchers study under the term environmental monotony. The brain's novelty detection systems, finding nothing new, begin reducing signal strength for the environment's existing features. In confinement, this represents a degradation of the perceptual systems needed to detect relevant environmental changes. The shift in air quality, the new sound in the wall, the subtle change in water level. Environmental monotony does not just produce boredom. It dulls the instruments with which the confined person monitors the environment for anything that might determine whether they survive. Fact 56. The floor of the ocean as context. At the bottom of the deepest ocean trenches, pressure is near 1,100 atmospheres. The darkness is total. The temperature is near freezing. The biological context is unusual. Chemosynthetic organisms live entirely without solar energy, in ecosystems fueled by geothermal heat and chemical gradients. For a human occupying this environment in a pressure vessel, the perceptual context is one of near-total informational poverty. There is nothing familiar to look at. There is nothing the brain recognizes as home. The occupant is in the most alien environment on Earth without leaving the planet. The psychological experience of existing in that alien context, regardless of physical safety, involves a form of existential displacement that has no equivalent in surface experience. The window between survivable and unsurvivable is measured in millimeters of steel. Fact 57. Body image distortion in prolonged confinement. Extended confinement produces documented distortions in body image and self-perception. In microgravity, astronauts report feeling taller, lighter, and spatially different, requiring proprioceptive recalibration. In underground confinement, where the body is repeatedly restricted to crawling, crouching, or lying positions, the felt boundaries of the body become unclear. Flotation tank research has documented temporary body boundary dissolution, inability to clearly perceive where one's body ends, in sessions as short as 90 minutes. In clinical studies of prolonged bed rest, subjects report feelings of the body spreading or becoming indistinct. These are not symptoms of mental illness in otherwise healthy individuals. They are the predictable outputs of proprioceptive and gravitational systems deprived of their normal range of input. The experience of not being sure of one's own body's boundaries is not metaphorical, it is physiological. Fact 58. The paradox of adequate air. In confinement scenarios where ventilation is sufficient, where oxygen levels are maintained, a paradox exists. The physiological systems governing the suffocation response are calibrated to chemical signals: blood CO2 concentration and blood oxygen saturation. These signals may indicate adequate air even in a psychological environment that feels like suffocation. Psychogenic dyspnea, the perception of breathing difficulty without physiological cause, has been documented in claustrophobic individuals and confinement research. Perceived threat activates the amygdala, which increases respiratory rate in ways that don't match normal breathing. The person feels they are not getting enough air. They breathe faster. This lowers blood CO2, producing lightheadedness and tingling, which confirm to the distress perception that something is wrong with the air. The body creates the symptom of the thing it fears. The air is fine. The catastrophe is being generated entirely from inside. Fact 59. Deriving safety from repetition. In extended confinement, the mind gravitates toward repetition as a source of stability. Rhythmic behaviors, counting, rocking, tapping, maintaining a regular breathing pattern, emerge spontaneously and increase in frequency as confinement extends. These behaviors represent the nervous system's attempt to impose regularity on an environment that provides none. Rhythmic input provides the predictable stimulation the brain needs to maintain regulatory tone. In clinical settings, stereotyped repetitive behaviors appear in studies of both human and animal populations under confinement. They serve a genuine function, creating a microenvironment of predictability inside an unpredictable macroenvironment. But they also represent the mind turning inward, away from the environment. The counting that begins as a coping mechanism can become, over time, a world unto itself. Fact 60. The limits of cortisol regulation. The cortisol response is designed for short-term activation. Under normal circumstances, an acute stressor activates the HPA axis, produces cortisol elevation, and the feedback loop returns levels to baseline within 60 to 90 minutes. In sustained confinement, this regulation fails progressively. Chronic stress overwhelms the negative feedback mechanism. At chronically elevated levels, cortisol begins producing effects that are themselves physiologically damaging. It impairs hippocampal neurogenesis, the formation of new neurons in memory-encoding structures. It suppresses immune function. It disrupts sleep. It elevates blood pressure. In studies of Chilean miners, Norwegian Arctic workers, and ISS astronauts, cortisol dysregulation has been documented and linked to specific cognitive and physical outcomes. The stress response activated to manage the confinement has, over time, become one of the confinement's significant dangers. Fact 61. What the body remembers of the space. Memory encoding in confinement environments follows unusual patterns. The hippocampus requires novel input to form strong memories. In environments of extreme monotony, very little that is new is being encoded. Survivors of extended confinement frequently report that the period feels like one long day in retrospect. Individual memories of specific hours or days are unavailable, blurred together in a single undifferentiated episode. This is not clinical amnesia. It is the predictable output of a memory system given nothing new to encode over an extended period. Studies of Chilean miners' post-rescue accounts show consistent difficulty reconstructing the chronological sequence of events during their 69 days underground. What the body remembers of the confinement is not a narrative. It is a texture, a prolonged, undifferentiated quality of being trapped that has no clear middle, and eventually, an end. Fact 62. The sound that should not be there. In advanced stages of sensory deprivation, auditory hallucinations progress from brief and simple toward greater complexity. Simple sounds give way to more elaborate acoustic events. Music has been reported by cave isolation subjects and extreme solo sailors. Voices coherent enough to seem like specific individuals. Environmental sounds that correspond to the outside world, traffic, wind, crowds, in environments where these are physically impossible. Research suggests these complex hallucinations represent the auditory system's increasingly ambitious attempts to populate the acoustic void. Pattern detection thresholds fall. In this state, the distinction between what the environment is generating and what the brain is generating dissolves in a functional, real-time sense. The person cannot fully trust their primary threat detection system. The ears listening for rescuers may also be hearing things that are not there. Fact 63. The dense forest and the disappearance of distance. In dense forest at night, sound is reflected, absorbed, and redirected by trees in ways that make directional localization unreliable. A sound appearing to come from the left may originate from behind. The visual system, largely non-functional below the canopy in darkness, cannot anchor distance perception. Proprioceptive systems register irregular ground covered in obstacles. The result is a perceptual environment where distance, direction, and scale become unreliable simultaneously. People lost in dense forest at night have been documented walking in circles not through conscious navigational error, but because the reference systems for maintaining direction have all simultaneously failed. The forest at night is not merely dark. It is a systematic dismantling of the perceptual apparatus that humans use to exist in space. Fact 64. The physiology of hope. Hope, in the context of confinement survival, is a measurable physiological variable, not merely an emotional attitude. Individuals who maintain expectation of rescue-specific, anchored hope, not vague optimism, show lower sustained cortisol levels, better sleep architecture, lower incidence of immune reactivation events, and better behavioral performance on signaling and resource management tasks than those who abandon expectation. The mechanism involves frontal lobe regulation suppressing amygdala hyperactivation. The cognitive act of hopping, specifically, reduces the physiological cost of the stress response, but hope that is repeatedly violated by false signals and extended duration is progressively harder to maintain. Its depletion, once far enough advanced, cannot easily be reversed. Hope and despair are not simply different emotional states. They are different biological conditions with different physical outcomes. Fact 65. Vibration as the absent sense. Normal inhabited environments contain a continuous background of low-frequency vibration from traffic, mechanical systems, and human movement. This vibrotactile input, received primarily through the feet and contact surfaces, provides a continuous low-level environmental signal for ambient assessment. Its absence is not consciously noticed until it is gone. Deep cave environments, sealed flotation tanks, and isolated bunker configurations feature near-complete absence of environmental vibration. Research on vibration deprivation in sleep contexts finds that absence of normal background vibration alters sleep architecture and increases the startle response to novel sounds. In confinement, the absence removes a sensory baseline against which environmental changes would normally be compared. The environment is completely flat in this particular sensory channel. The nervous system, calibrated for a baseline that is no longer present, has one fewer reference when it most needs accurate calibration. Fact 66. Spatial compression and its neurological signature. The hippocampus has been studied in individuals who have spent extended periods in confined environments, submariners, Antarctic winterover personnel, and spaceflight crew. Research published in the Journal of Neuroscience documents structural shifts in the hippocampus following long-duration spaceflight. Gray matter density in regions associated with spatial navigation changes measurably over a 6-month mission. These changes are not permanent in most cases. They begin to reverse upon return to a normal spatial environment, but they represent genuine neurological adaptation to an environment in which the normal range of spatial processing demands has been dramatically reduced. The hippocampus reorganizes in response to the demands placed on it. In confinement, the demands placed on it are not the demands for which it was built. Fact 67. The inner voice under pressure. The internal monologue changes in documented ways under confinement conditions. Initially, it tends to become more organized and purposeful, planning, assessing, reasoning explicitly in sequential language. As confinement extends and cognitive resources deplete, the inner voice loses this organized character. It becomes more repetitive and emotionally driven, less sequential in its logic. Research in long-duration isolation contexts found that journaling, externalizing the inner voice in written form, serves as a mirror, allowing subjects to assess the quality of their own thinking. Subjects who journaled performed significantly better on cognitive tasks at week 3 compared to those who did not. Without that interruption, the confinement's effect on cognition proceeds internally and invisibly, with no external reference to calibrate against. The deterioration continues until the person can no longer clearly see that it is happening. Fact 68. The oxygen curve. At 20.9% oxygen, human cognitive function is optimal. At 19.5%, the OSHA threshold for oxygen-deficient environments, mild fatigue may be detectable. At 16%, coordination becomes impaired and judgment begins to deteriorate. At 12%, poor judgment and faulty memory are pronounced. At 10%, loss of consciousness follows quickly. The critical detail is that the person descending this curve does not experience a clear subjective warning. Oxygen deficiency produces subtle cognitive dulling that does not feel, from the inside, like cognitive dulling. The person may feel slightly warm, mildly unfocused, perhaps mildly euphoric. The capacity to recognize that something is wrong decreases as the ability to think is being removed. The instrument that would measure the danger is the instrument being disabled. Fact 69. Social phantom limb. Extended social isolation produces a phenomenon documented independently in long-duration solo sailing, Antarctic overwintering, and solitary confinement research. Subjects begin experiencing what might be called social phantom processing, the auditory, visual, or proprioceptive sense of another person's presence without any actual other person. Some solo sailors have reported comforting senses of companionship that provided psychological stability during extreme periods of stress. Others find the unbidden perception of an absent presence deeply alarming. The mechanism likely involves the social brain network, the temporoparietal junction and medial prefrontal cortex, generating social perception in the absence of social input, driven by the same process as visual hallucinations in darkness. The isolated brain, deprived of social data it normally processes continuously, begins generating its own. The companions it creates are the brain's own inventory of personhood, returned to it by its own processes. Fact 70. The changing meaning of time. In survival accounts from individuals who spent weeks or months confined, a consistent theme emerges. The passage of time acquires a different quality. Not simply that it passes more slowly or quickly, though both are reported, but that its relationship to meaning changes. In ordinary life, time is constituted by what happens within it. In extreme confinement, where very little happens, time becomes visible as a thing in itself, a medium that passes regardless of whether anything occurs within it. Survivors describe this as one of the philosophically significant consequences of their confinement. The experience of time as independent of content, as something that continues with or without the person's participation, did not, for many, fully return to its pre-confinement state after rescue. The confinement changed what time felt like, permanently. Fact 71. Interpersonal space and its violation. Personal space, the zone around the body within which another person's presence without permission triggers mild stress responses, generally ranges from 45 to 120 centimeters for non-intimate social interactions. In a submarine corridor, a mine refuge chamber, or a group survival scenario, maintaining even minimal personal space is impossible. Research on crowding in confined spaces consistently shows that sustained personal space violation produces elevated cortisol, increased blood pressure, heightened irritability, and reduced prosocial behavior, even between individuals who are well acquainted and highly cooperative. The body does not care about intentions. The violation of proximity norms activates threat-adjacent responses regardless of context. Colleagues living within each other's personal space for 6 weeks are not fully the same people they would be if ordinary spatial norms had been maintainable. Fact 72. Light toxicity in confined spaces. Certain confinement environments, control rooms, nuclear facilities, some submarine interiors maintain lighting that is bright, uniform, and constant. The circadian system depends not just on the presence of light, but on its variation in intensity, spectral composition, and timing. Constant intensity artificial light suppresses melatonin production continuously, preventing the natural rise in melatonin that initiates sleep preparation. Workers in constant light environments report chronic sleep difficulty, even when schedules nominally permit sufficient rest. Mood dysregulation follows, specifically increased anxiety and agitation, rather than the depression associated with darkness-dominated environments. Constant bright illumination also reduces visual adaptive range and increases visual fatigue. In confined environments that are constantly lit, the light installed to sustain function is simultaneously preventing the recovery that function requires. Fact 73. The morphology of despair. Despair in confinement has a specific neurobiological profile distinct from ordinary sadness. Research on individuals in extreme confinement, solitary confinement, long-duration cave isolation, disaster survival has documented patterns corresponding to severe depression, anhedonia, psychomotor retardation, cognitive narrowing, and in the most extreme cases, vegetative withdrawal. This vegetative state, in which the person reduces activity to biological minimum, ceasing to signal, ceasing to engage, is considered among the most dangerous confinement outcomes, because a person in this state will not take the actions necessary for rescue, even when those actions remain physically possible. The neurochemical substrate, depletion of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin under sustained stress, parallels clinical depression closely enough that psychiatrists treating returned confinement survivors frequently find major depressive episodes requiring the same interventions as depression arising from any other cause. Fact 74. Recalibration failure after extreme cold. As core body temperature falls to 30–35 degrees Celsius, confusion, slurred speech, and poor coordination develop. Below 28 degrees, cardiac arrhythmia and death become likely. The phenomenon of particular relevance to confinement psychology is paradoxical undressing, documented in approximately 20 to 50% of hypothermia fatalities found outdoors. As hypothermia progresses, vasoconstriction that has been restricting blood flow to extremities sometimes rapidly reverses, flooding the skin with warm blood and producing an intense sensation of burning heat. The mildly hypothermic person, experiencing what the skin reports as extreme overheating, removes their clothing. This is not a decision. It is a physiological event that the cognitive system, already impaired by reduced core temperature, cannot override. The body, in the process of dying, tells the brain it is burning, and the brain, partially incapacitated, believes it. Fact 75. The confined mind's last negotiation. In the final stages of cognitive deterioration under sustained confinement stress, the prefrontal cortex undergoes a characteristic last sequence before losing effectiveness. Decision-making becomes anchored to emotional rather than rational weighting. Familiar, emotionally significant content, specific faces, specific places, specific memories, becomes more cognitively prominent than actionable practical information. The person may spend diminishing cognitive resources on mental review of these memories rather than on survival behaviors. This is not irrational in the traditional sense. It is the cognitive system's attempt to maintain continuity of selfhood as the regulatory systems fail. The self, at the end of its cognitive resources, reaches for the material that constitutes it most fundamentally. What the mind chooses to do with its last operating resources is, consistently, to hold as much of itself together as it can. Fact 76. The rerouted reward system. In extended confinement, the brain's mesolimbic dopamine system reorients in response to the dramatic reduction in the reward landscape. Activities producing no stimulation in normal environments become rewarding. The arrival of any novel sensory event, a change in air temperature, a different sound, produces dopaminergic response disproportionate to what the stimulus would warrant outside. This reorientation has been documented in long-duration isolation studies. The most consistently reported sensory experience upon rescue is not dramatic, usually light, fresh air, or a familiar human face, but is experienced with overwhelming intensity by a reward system that has been operating in profound impoverishment. Some survivors describe these first post-confinement sensory experiences as among the most intensely felt of their lives. The intensity reveals, in its scale, the depth of the deprivation that preceded it. Fact 77. The impermanence of the boundary. In sufficiently advanced confinement-induced psychological disruption, the boundary between self and environment loses its normal functional stability. This has been documented in extreme isolation research, prolonged cave isolation accounts, and clinical reports from individuals who have spent months in solitary confinement. The person begins to experience the environment as continuous with the self, neither purely external nor purely other. Researchers have various theoretical frameworks for this phenomenon, but its consistent presence across disparate confinement contexts suggests it reflects a fundamental limit of the normal self-environment boundary maintenance systems. These systems require input, variety, and social contact to maintain calibration. Remove all three inputs for long enough, and the boundary reveals itself to be maintained by those inputs. The space and the person within it begin, in some neurological sense, to merge. Fact 78. The accumulated weight of involuntary confinement. There is a clear distinction in psychological research between voluntary and involuntary confinement outcomes. Voluntary confinement, a caver who chose to go underground, an astronaut who applied for a mission, carries an internal locus of control that modulates the stress response. The person has chosen the environment. Their agency is preserved even when physical movements are constrained. Involuntary confinement, a collapse, an entrapment, a shipwreck, removes that agency completely. The same physical environment, experienced without the perception of choice, produces dramatically elevated cortisol, faster cognitive deterioration, and more rapid development of helplessness-related behavioral changes. This differential is not explained by physical conditions. It is explained entirely by the psychological fact of choice. The body knows the difference between exploring and being trapped. The word matters. The nervous system has its own response to it. Fact 79. The night side of long confinement. In documented accounts of long-duration confinement lasting more than 30 days, there is a consistent report of a night-side experience, a phase characterized by a qualitative shift into a darker, more destabilized psychological state. It does not correspond to a specific day or event. Coping strategies that were working stop working. The mind's ordinary methods for generating stability become inadequate. Dreams during this period are reported as particularly vivid and unsettling, a consequence of REM sleep rebound following disrupted sleep architecture. The boundary between waking and sleep becomes less distinct. Ideas intrude into waking consciousness with the quality of dreams. Survivors most commonly describe this phase as having left lasting marks on their psychological functioning, not the confinement in its totality, but this particular phase within it. It is the moment that changes something. Fact 80. Chronic adaptation and its hidden cost. The human nervous system is extraordinarily adaptive. People can adapt functionally to environments that initially seem psychologically impossible to survive. Submariners function effectively on extended patrols. Antarctic personnel complete their assignments. Astronauts conduct research for 6 months in a vehicle the size of a house trailer. This adaptation is real. What is less commonly noted is that it has costs that are not immediately visible. The nervous system that adapted to function within extreme confinement has done so by reorganizing its baseline. The chronobiology that drifted during submarine deployment does not fully reset within days of surfacing. The immune modifications, the hippocampal changes, the cortisol baseline shifts, these recover on timescales of weeks to months. The adaptive success of surviving confinement leaves behind, in the nervous system, the record of what was survived. Fact 81. The permanent reorganization of space. For individuals who have survived extended, severe confinement, the perception of spatial environments does not simply return to pre-confinement baseline upon release. Research on mine disaster survivors, hostages, and individuals released from long-term solitary confinement, consistently documents lasting changes in spatial perception and spatial preference. Large, open spaces, which most people find comfortable, are experienced as disorienting or threatening for extended periods following release. The nervous system, calibrated during confinement to interpret small enclosed spaces as normal, perceives large spaces as anomalous and potentially dangerous. Open environments with complex stimulation and absent boundaries may be overwhelming. This is not permanent in most cases, but its duration is measured in months to years, not days. In some documented cases, it does not fully resolve. Fact 82. Identity without context. Extended confinement strips away most contextual anchors through which ordinary identity is maintained. In normal life, identity is partly sustained through role, through activity, and through familiar environments carrying personal history and social meaning. In confinement, these anchors are progressively removed. The roles are inaccessible when the social world to which they belong is absent. The activities are constrained to near irrelevance. The environment is entirely unfamiliar. Research on individuals in long-duration isolation documents a progressive thinning of the sense of self, a reduction in the psychological density of self-awareness. Who the person is becomes less clear to them. They retain memories, values, and preferences, but the full, thick experience of being that particular person, with that particular life in that particular moment of ongoing history, attenuates. The person remains. The context that made the person vivid is gone. Fact 83. What the body encodes that the mind does not. The body encodes the experience of confinement in ways that bypass conscious memory formation and persist after the confinement has ended. This is the mechanism underlying somatic symptoms of trauma, physical sensations and states encoded not in explicit autobiographical memory, but in the body's learned responses to specific stimuli. Survivors of building collapse may experience acute cardiovascular arousal in response to low-frequency vibration years later, the vibration that, during the collapse, signaled structural movement. Minors may respond to small enclosed spaces with physiological profiles, heart rate, respiratory rate, cortisol disproportionate to any rational threat assessment. These are not memories in the conventional sense. They are the body's version of learning. The confinement continues to be remembered by the body, in its own language, long after the conscious mind has processed the event and moved on. Fact 84. The contamination of familiar spaces. For individuals who have experienced severe confinement, the perceptual contamination of previously familiar spaces is among the most practically disruptive long-term effects. A person trapped in an elevator may experience acute anxiety in any elevator for months or years, not through conscious association, but because the body's environmental response systems have been recalibrated. The generalization of fear responses from the specific confinement environment to structurally similar environments is well documented in post-traumatic stress research, but it extends further than direct structural similarity. The emotional signature of confinement, helplessness, enclosure, loss of control, may be triggered by environments that share only abstract features with the original. A car wash, a medical scanning tube, a crowded theater, spaces that never frightened the person before. The world after confinement is a different world, perceived through an evaluative system that has been permanently adjusted by the experience of being unable to leave. Fact 85. Neurological scar tissue. The concept of neurological scar tissue captures something genuine about the lasting effects of severe psychological stress on neural architecture. The hippocampus shows volume reduction in individuals who have experienced chronic severe stress, a finding replicated across numerous clinical populations. The amygdala shows altered connectivity and sensitivity following chronic stress exposure. The prefrontal cortex shows reduced gray matter density in chronically stressed populations, with corresponding reductions in executive function measurements. These changes are not reversible on short timescales. Some show partial recovery over years. Some do not. The person who emerged from extended confinement carries these changes in the mass and connectivity of their neural tissue. They are, in a literal neurobiological sense, a different brain than the one that entered the confinement. Fact 86. The language of return. Individuals who have survived extended confinement consistently report a specific difficulty upon return, a disruption in the language available to communicate what the experience was like to people who have not shared it. This is not simply a difficulty of description. It is a fundamental problem of conceptual framework. The experience of extended confinement produces perceptual and psychological states with no direct equivalent in ordinary life. The quality of total dark in a sealed cave, the texture of time in a bunker at week 4, these are not things for which ordinary language has precise vocabulary, because ordinary language was developed by people who did not regularly inhabit those states. Survivors report conversations that feel like translation failures. The isolation produced by the confinement does not end at rescue. It continues in the persistent gap between the experience that was had and the language available to convey it. Fact 87. Post-confinement sensory flooding. Upon emergence from severe sensory deprivation or extended low-stimulation confinement, the nervous system encounters a sudden flood of sensory input for which it is temporarily poorly calibrated. The threshold adjustments made during confinement, increases in auditory gain, heightened olfactory sensitivity, elevated tactile responsiveness, are calibrated for the impoverished environment. In normal environments, they produce overstimulation. Sounds are too loud. Colors are too saturated. Crowds are overwhelming. This post-confinement sensory flooding has been documented in released hostages, returned polar workers, resurfaced submariners, and cave isolation research subjects. It typically resolves within days to weeks, but during the period of flooding, the person is navigating return to ordinary life while experiencing it as physiologically intense in ways no one around them recognizes. The world that is supposed to feel like relief feels, instead, like assault. Fact 88. What survives the darkness? Longitudinal studies of individuals who survived extended severe confinement identify a consistent pattern of value reorganization. Activities and relationships previously taken for granted acquire heightened significance. Concerns that once occupied substantial psychological real estate, professional status, social comparison, frequently diminish in perceived importance. This reorganization is not trivial or temporary in many documented cases. It is described as enduring, and as one of the few outcomes of the experience the person does not wish had not occurred. The mechanism likely involves the experience of existing at biological baseline, having all non-essential concerns stripped away by the totality of confinement, and the consequent clarity about what that baseline felt like to sustain. What the person cared about when they could care about nothing else is, after the confinement, what they know they actually care about. Some things survive the darkness. Fact 89. The threshold of irreversibility. Research on the neurological and psychological effects of confinement identifies a threshold, imprecise, variable, and dependent on individual factors, beyond which certain effects cannot be fully reversed by removal of the confinement condition. For hippocampal volume reduction, partial but not complete recovery has been documented over periods of 1 to 3 years. For some amygdala-mediated fear responses, associations formed under extreme confinement show long-term potentiation, effects that standard extinction protocols affect only partially. For HPA axis dysregulation, normalization may require months of deliberate environmental management. The threshold of irreversibility does not mean permanent, unchanged damage. It means that beyond certain durations and intensities of confinement stress, the nervous system's return to its original configuration is no longer automatic, no longer guaranteed, and no longer independent of sustained intervention. Fact 90. The cave diver's last breath. Cave diving represents one of the most fatality-associated forms of exploration. When cave divers die in submerged cave systems, the cause is most commonly not equipment failure. It is navigation failure, air calculation failure, or panic-induced behavioral disorganization. The failure sequence documented in post-incident analyses follows a recognizable pattern. Disorientation occurs, triggering the cortisol and adrenaline surge of acute threat response, which increases respiratory rate, which depletes the remaining air supply faster than planned. The person who calculated survival time at their original breathing rate runs out of air before they should, because discovering they are lost increased the rate at which they consumed the resource they needed most to find their way back. The confinement beneath the water, like all the others, makes the most dangerous mistakes more likely precisely when they can be least afforded. Fact 91. Memory consolidation after extreme confinement. The hippocampus consolidates episodic memories during sleep, primarily during slow wave and REM stages. In confinement environments where sleep architecture is severely disrupted, this consolidation process is correspondingly impaired. Studies of returned confinement survivors show specific patterns of memory fragmentation: clear recall of the earliest hours, patchy or absent recall of the middle period, and clearer recall of the period immediately preceding rescue. This pattern mirrors what would be expected if memory consolidation failed during the intermediate period due to sleep disruption. The psychological consequence is a gap in the narrative of self. The person knows what happened at the beginning and at the end. The middle, sometimes the longest part of the confinement, has no story. What cannot be remembered cannot fully be processed, and what cannot be processed cannot, in the fullest sense, be resolved. Fact 92. What the darkness reassigns. Without visual input, which in normal waking life consumes approximately 30% of cortical processing, that processing capacity becomes available to other systems. The internal world expands to fill the available space. Memories, fantasies, and abstract thinking become more vivid and more consuming. The past, which in ordinary visual life competes with the immediate visual environment, dominates. Time in total darkness is time spent primarily inside the self, because the self is the most stimulating thing available. This inward turn has been described by cave isolation researchers as sometimes profound, a forced intimacy with one's own mental contents unavailable in ordinary life. But it also means that the quality of that inner world, the stability of self-concept, the healthiness of thought patterns, becomes the primary determinant of the psychological experience. The darkness reveals what the light was covering. Fact 93. The return that doesn't end. For a significant proportion of individuals who have experienced severe, extended confinement, return to ordinary life is not a single event, but a prolonged process spanning years. Post-traumatic stress disorder has been documented at elevated rates across virtually every population of severe confinement survivors for whom longitudinal data exists. Even in individuals who do not meet the clinical PTSD threshold, subclinical persistence of symptoms, hypervigilance, sleep disruption, spatial anxiety, persistent body memory responses is common. These symptoms often fluctuate, absent for months then renewed by sensory or contextual triggers. The confinement ended on a specific date. The return from it is not on the same calendar. It is ongoing, non-linear, and marked not by a single resolution, but by a series of partial recoveries that collectively constitute, over years, a new relationship with the experience of having been trapped. Fact 94. The brain at the bottom of the well. The vasovagal syncope, a sudden drop in heart rate and blood pressure mediated by the vagus nerve, producing brief loss of consciousness, occurs when the sympathetic nervous system, maintaining an extreme arousal state, is overwhelmed by a parasympathetic rebound. In a confined space, a fall can be catastrophic in ways the same fall in open space would not be. But the neurological significance of vasovagal syncope in extreme confinement is also its implication about capacity limits. The arousal system has been running at maximum output for too long. What the syncope represents is not simply a physiological event. It is the body's signature that it has been asked to remain at emergency capacity for longer than emergency capacity was designed to sustain. The brain at the bottom of the well is not simply confined. It is running on a system that is, in that moment, at the edge of what it was made to do. Fact 95. The shape of learned helplessness. Martin Seligman's model of learned helplessness describes a state in which repeated experience of uncontrollable negative events produces a cognitive and motivational deficit that persists even when controllability is restored. In confinement, conditions for this are systematically present. The person repeatedly attempts to influence their situation, signaling, repositioning, problem-solving, and repeatedly receives no response. Each unsuccessful attempt builds expectation that outcomes are not contingent on behavior. When this expectation becomes generalized, motivational collapse follows. The person stops trying not by decision, but because the reward system has been trained through repeated unreinforced attempts to treat effort as futile. This is not a character failure. It is the output of a reward learning system working exactly as designed. What the confinement taught it was profoundly wrong. Unlearning it requires exposure to controllable outcomes that the person, still confined, cannot access. Fact 96. The closed atmosphere. In any sealed environment where humans breathe, a closed atmospheric ecology develops. CO2 builds unless scrubbed. Water vapor accumulates from respiration. Volatile organic compounds, emitted from human skin, metabolic processes, materials, and equipment, accumulate in concentrations that in open environments would be continuously diluted. In closed environments, they build. Studies of spacecraft cabin air chemistry, the most thoroughly analyzed closed atmosphere human environment, have identified dozens of volatile organic compounds accumulating to detectable levels over the course of a mission. Some are monitored and scrubbed. Others are not fully understood in their chronic low-level effects on cognition and mood. The air that the confined person breathes is, progressively, the record of their own metabolic history. They are, in the most literal sense, living inside themselves. Fact 97. The irreducible weight of not knowing. Among all the psychological burdens of confinement, the burden most consistently reported by survivors and most consistently defying cognitive management is not knowing. Not knowing if rescue is coming, not knowing how long it has been, not knowing if the structure above is stable. The human nervous system is designed to assess threats, assign probabilities, make decisions, and act. When the information required for these processes is entirely absent, the system does not rest. It continues attempting to assess and decide. Without the informational substrate these processes require, it generates simulations. It revisits available information repeatedly, finding nothing new. It escalates urgency without being able to resolve it. The weight of not knowing is not passive uncertainty. It is the mind working at full capacity on a task that full capacity cannot solve. Fact 98. When the self reconfigures. There is a phenomenon documented at the extreme end of long-duration confinement that researchers describe as self-reconfiguration, a change in the experience center of the self, distinct from personality change. The person who existed before the confinement, their characteristic emotional tone, default cognitive style, habitual relationship to experience, has been modified at a level below conscious choice. The modification is not the addition of new experiences to an unchanged self. It is a reorganization of the self around those experiences, such that who the person was before is no longer quite the same as the current organizing center. Survivors describe meeting the person they were before the confinement and recognizing them as a prior version, genuinely themselves, but operating from a structure that no longer exactly matches who they are now. The confinement did not simply happen to the self, it happened inside it. Fact 99. The body that outlasted the mind. In the most extreme confinement scenarios documented in medical literature, a striking pattern emerges. The body continues functioning long after the organized mind has largely withdrawn. The autonomic nervous system, heart rate regulation, breathing, basic thermoregulation, immune surveillance, continues without cessation regardless of the state of conscious organization. People have been found alive after conditions that, assessed from the outside, seemed incompatible with continued conscious engagement. The biology of survival operates below the level at which the self is consciously present. The heartbeat continues. The respiratory drive continues. The immune system continues. These systems do not require a coherent narrative self to function. The self and the body entered the confinement together. They do not always emerge from it in the same condition. Fact 100. What confinement proves about openness. Research on human confinement, taken in its totality, consistently demonstrates something about human beings that is rarely acknowledged in ordinary life. That the sense of being free, of existing in a space that could be left, does far more cognitive and psychological work than is recognized while it is present. The open door most people never walk through, the window most people rarely examine, the street they could turn onto but generally do not, these constitute an environmental context that the nervous system requires for its basic functional architecture. Remove the possibility of exit, and the nervous system immediately begins reorganizing for confinement. Remove it long enough and the reorganization deepens, hardens, becomes structural. Confinement proves, by removing it, how much of what feels most essentially human about conscious experience depends on the simple, unexamined, continuously available fact of being able to leave. There is no dramatic conclusion to what has been examined here. The 100 environments and physiological events covered throughout do not resolve into a simple thesis. What they demonstrate, collectively, is something more patient and more persistent. The human nervous system was shaped, across hundreds of thousands of years, by a world of open space, of changing light, of ambient sound, of social contact, of movement through varied terrain. The environments described in these facts, the sealed submarine, the collapsed corridor, the flooded cave, the bunker 3 levels underground, exist at the precise edge of what that nervous system can accommodate. They are not outside its range, but they require it to do something it was not designed for, to sustain function without the basic environmental inputs on which function was calibrated to depend. The people who survive these environments intact, or partially intact, or permanently changed, are not demonstrating a special category of human capacity. They are demonstrating the range and limits of an ordinary one. The cortisol, the hippocampal changes, the auditory hallucinations, the behavioral inversion, the dissolving boundary between self and space. These are not failures of the nervous system. They are the nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do, in conditions for which it was never built. The calm of ordinary life is not a permanent condition. It is a threshold, and like all thresholds, it is only fully visible from the other side.